MintPress News live stream. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon on January 6th. This is a historic day here in the United States where a sham trial of Venezuela's internationally recognized President Nicolas Maduro is sitting on trial in New York City. But before we get started, we want to remind everyone that MintPress News is an independent media outlet. We recently had all of our funds from our fundraiser on Indiegogo withheld from us. So your support means so much to us to keep these kinds of live streams and reporting possible. And my name is Mnar Adley, for those who don't know who I am, and I'm the founder and director of MintPress News. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We want to get started to talk about this very historic day here in the US, January 6th, excuse me, where the sham trial of Venezuela's internationally recognized president, Nicolas Maduro, is on trial right now in New York City. On January 3rd, the elected president of Venezuela was kidnapped and flown to the US to face drug smuggling charges in a case that is already falling apart. Prosecutors have already admitted that the Cartel of the Suns, the drugs organization Maduro suddenly led, does not even exist. Moreover, the supposed key witness in the investigation, which we're going to talk about more, so stay with us, has a deeply shady history and ties working with US intelligence, with the CIA. Now, Maduro pled not guilty and asserted that he is a prisoner of war. And he is a prisoner of war. Yet Donald Trump has insisted that the US is not at war with Venezuela. And that is a direct lie. But how else to describe sending in special forces to kidnap the head of state of a foreign country? And that's another thing. After a decades-long campaign to undermine and attack Venezuela, the media are playing their part, refusing to describe Trump's blatantly illegal actions that violate international law as a kidnapping, or the fact that it is illegal. Now, if you look at coverage from CNN to the BBC, they are barely even talking about the drug trafficking charges. They are mostly talking about this from a place of that the Venezuelan people want human rights and are celebrating this. And the BBC has made it very explicit. Its news editor has been sending a memo to all journalists explicitly telling them to avoid using the word kidnapped. While Western leaders have welcomed the move, Maduro's arrest has sparked protests across Venezuela and the world opposing Trump's actions, opposing the fact that Trump was able to kidnap a sitting president. This sets a major, major implication for international politics. But you rarely see those on social media. Instead, what we have seen is a spate of AI-generated videos claiming to show Venezuelans rising up against their tyrannical government and welcoming Trump's attack. In reality, very few people inside Venezuela actually welcome their country being attacked and potentially being turned into another Libya-style civil war. One Venezuelan who has, though, is Maria Corina Machado, who promised her newly acquired Nobel Peace Prize to Trump if he would only just overthrow the entire government of Venezuela that's leading the Bolivarian Revolution and put her in the rows where she has been groomed by the US national security state for decades. And all of this has certainly distracted us from, of course, the Epstein files, where Trump's name was implicated more than 600 times. 600 times. And these are crimes related to the disgraced sex trafficker. Can you imagine if China or Russia just came into Washington, D.C. and kidnapped President Trump for his crimes against humanity? This would be unquestionably the biggest story with calls for intervention and sanctions. But when we do it, when the US empire does it, it's just politics. It also sends a shot across the bow to many other countries, including Cuba and Colombia, who Trump has now said is next in line for regime change. Is this the latest chapter in the new Cold War against Russia and China? And with Europe kowtowing to Trump on Maduro, an American invasion and annexation of Greenland over minerals seems all the more likely as the new Cold War begins to heat up. Now, we're going to talk about all of this one by one. We're going to break this down between myself and MintPress senior staff writer and producer, Alan MacLeod. He's the author of the book, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Mnar, on this worrying day.
Thank you. And I just want to, before we start, I want to just mention a couple of things. Since reporting on Venezuela and opposing this clear violation of international law with our own President Donald Trump kidnapping Nicolas Maduro on these bogus claims of drug trafficking, my page, and I'm sure, Alan, your page as well, has been bombarded with pro-interventionist Venezuelans, most of them expatriates based in Miami, telling us, how could we talk about Venezuela when, we're not from there? And they said to us, like, you should go to Venezuela and see for yourself. Well, we just want to remind people who are watching that both Alan and I have been to Venezuela multiple times. I was there as an election observer, an independent election observer, and as an independent journalist in 2021, among hundreds of international election observers in an election that is the most observed and transparent in the world. And during my trip there, I traveled across many states inside Venezuela. I met with people on the ground independently, and I came across many people that were from elitist communities and from the barrios, from the poorest neighborhoods inside of Venezuela. And I spoke with people directly. And so, yes, we are in a place to talk about this. Alan wrote a book, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting. We've been analyzing the news. And so as independent journalists, our job is to scrutinize our own government's corruption and violations of international law. That is our job, and we will continue to do that no matter the intimidation that we receive. And despite this bogus sham, trial, Trump has made it very clear that the intentions here are for oil. I mean, this is like the emperor without its clothes on. He's saying the quiet part out loud, and he's not doing it like the Democrats, where they pretend to really care about human rights and we're there to save the people. No, he's saying that we are there for the oil. We're going to play this video of him saying that. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but just for the sake of this video, we are going to play this. 1 second.
Venezuela, or do other things in Latin America?
Anywhere drugs are pouring in, anywhere, not just Venezuela. Yes.
Speaking of Venezuela,
Yeah.
oil, what are we going to do with the oil that we have?
Going to do with what?
The oil that has been seized. The United States seized 1.9 million barrels of oil on December 10th.
We're going to keep it. We're keeping it.
Where's it going? Are we going to sell it or put it in the strategic
Maybe
oil
we'll sell
reserve?
it. Maybe we'll keep it. Maybe we'll use it in the strategic reserves. We're keeping it. We're keeping the ships also. Yeah, please.
About Venezuela, sir, have you spoken to American oil companies that have had their assets seized about what a post-Maduro
Yes.
Venezuela would mean for them, of what coming
I have
back and restarting
all
operations?
the big ones. Yeah, I have. Yeah, please.
Why do you feel like this initiative was neglected for so many years? And does this come amidst the rising tensions between the US and Venezuela?
We're talking about with Venezuela?
Yes.
Well, you had a different kind of a president before me. They didn't mind being ripped off. They didn't mind being robbed. They didn't mind drugs pouring into our country. They didn't mind the jails of Venezuela and Nicaragua being emptied into the US, where they take over Colorado and other places.
All right, so a very blatant admission that this war is about oil, and I want to talk more about that. But let's start with the very basics of what's happening today and this week specifically, which is the abduction, the U.S. abduction of President Maduro. He is now on trial in New York City. Let's talk a little bit about where we are in that trial, since that's the newest and latest information. What is Maduro accused of, and how credible these accusations are? Alan, if you can break that down.
I mean, sure. So I guess the main thrust of the US argument, or the US accusations, is that President Maduro is the head of a huge cocaine smuggling organization called the Cartel of the Suns, El Cartel de los Soles. The US claims that Venezuela has exported hundreds of tons of cocaine, flooding the streets of the United States. There's very little evidence for this. Already the prosecution has been forced to admit that the Cartel of the Suns doesn't even exist as an organization. Furthermore, if you've actually been reading drugs reports for the last however many years, going back decades, like reports from the United Nations or even US government organizations like the Drug Enforcement Agency, Venezuela is barely even talked about in these things. And it makes clear that Venezuela is not a major producer of drugs, and is not a major conduit of drugs either. The amount of illegal narcotics that enter the US that come from Venezuela or are smuggled through Venezuela is absolutely minuscule. And it is highly ironic, given that we know where these drugs come from. In terms of cocaine anyway, which is what Trump likes to talk about when it comes to Venezuela, we know where it's produced. It's produced largely in the Andean region, places like Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador, and it is shipped through the Pacific route from Ecuador. What's particularly notable about that is that Ecuador is actually ruled by President Noboa, who is one of the country's richest men. His family owns a gigantic banana business, and investigative reports have shown that for years the Noboa family have used this banana business to transport drugs all around the world, hidden in their shipping containers. And yet the United States does absolutely nothing about this. And just weeks ago, the former president of Honduras, another key US ally in the region, was pardoned by Donald Trump after he was sentenced to decades in prison for his role as being a major cocaine and narcotics kingpin. So the whole thing is absolutely ludicrous on its face. And of course, we have to remember that the United States itself has always controlled the drugs trade. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. In the 1980s, the US launched Operation Cyclone, which funneled more than $1 billion to the Afghan Mujahideen in order to overthrow the left-wing USSR-backed government there. And what they did was they tried to find ways in which to fund this gigantic army that they were doing. And they came up with a very clear idea, which was to plant heroin across Afghanistan. And it turned Afghanistan into a narco state. And it was so bad that when the Taliban came into power in the 90s, they immediately eradicated this drug, and only for the United States to invade and for heroin to absolutely explode again. And now, more than 20 years after that, we see that Afghanistan is now again ruled by the Taliban, and heroin production has fallen off a cliff once more. We know that the United States has done this for decades. In Latin America, we know that the CIA worked with the Contra rebels in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, and they helped them flood American communities, particularly Black communities, with crack cocaine, which fueled a huge epidemic in the 1980s. And that money was then put into funding gigantic reactionary death squads all across the region of Central America, which went around carrying out genocidal actions. This was all exposed by the great journalist Gary Webb, of course. And we can go even closer into the Trump administration and look at Marco Rubio himself, the Secretary of State. He is very close to drug kingpins. In fact, his own brother-in-law was sentenced to more than a decade in prison for his role in supplying and selling cocaine on the streets of the United States. And Rubio himself was actually living in his brother-in-law's apartment when he was busted. And after he got out, he pressured local lawmakers to give his brother-in-law a property realtor license so that he could get his life back on track. And that's one of the many reasons why so many people in Latin America call Rubio Narco Rubio. The whole star witness of this case is Hugo Carvajal, who was very high up in military intelligence in Venezuela in the 2000s, but really has been kind of a non-person for more than a decade. He got in huge trouble because of criminal actions, particularly around drugs in the 2010s. He suddenly became a huge opponent of the Venezuelan government and became a huge supporter of Juan Guaido. He fled to Spain and wanted political asylum there, but then he was indicted to the United States, clearly under huge pressure. And in fact, this June, previous June, because we're in a new year, 2026, of course, the Miami Herald reported that he had actually struck a plea deal with the United States government, which would grant him, and I'm quoting here, a considerable sentence reduction if he provides substantial assistance to US investigations, end quote. And those investigations were, of course, trying to frame Nicolas Maduro as a major drugs kingpin. So this is clearly a case of a coerced witness, a biased witness, a ludicrous attempt to try to frame a country which basically doesn't produce drugs as this huge a centerpiece of the worldwide narcotics trade. It's falling apart to the point where now one of the major accusations and crimes that Maduro is supposed to have committed, one of them is the possession of machine guns, which is absolutely ludicrous if you think about it. Would you think that, some country should invade another one and kidnap a head of state because they possessed firearms? The whole thing is absolutely ludicrous on its face. But unfortunately, our corporate media is taking this as if this is a good faith attempt to spread freedom and democracy, which it absolutely is not. It's a power play by the Trump administration to try to reinforce this idea of American hegemony on the Americas, which they've been trying to hold out, trying to carry out and achieve for 200 years since the proclaiming of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823.
Absolutely. And do we know anything about the judge or this courtroom? I was reading that people like Luigi Magnoni, he's one of the people that have been in this courtroom, and others like high profile people. Can you add any information about that?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting that this judge has been sparring with Luigi Mangione. Yeah, he's a very senior judge. I believe he's 92 years old now. He's worked his way up the corrupt American legal system. He's had his fights with Donald Trump before, but I think I think when it comes to U.S. empire, he's certainly not sticking his neck out there. Ultimately, if you get to that position in the US judiciary, you're not going to be a radical rocking the boat. So I'm not expecting anything other than a complete sham trial in a kangaroo court from this judge in New York City.
Yeah, I don't really see anything good coming out of this, and the global implications of this whole situation is extremely troubling. And we want to clarify some things. There are people celebrating Maduro being kidnapped right now, and those are the Venezuelan expatriates inside of Miami. A lot of these are white, they're elitists, they're very, very wealthy, and they want US capitalism to enter their country. They want that. They want a McDonald's, they want a Starbucks, not but these corporations to be in their country. They want the American dream, the fake American dream to enter Venezuela and take over. They're very, very happy that Trump abducted and kidnapped Maduro, and they're all over social media celebrating this. And I just want to acknowledge that they do exist, but they still are actually a minority of the people that support this situation. But this is a case of Stockholm syndrome. The United States has waged an economic maximum pressure campaign against not just the government and the economy of Venezuela, but all of the people of Venezuela. They are responsible for the prevention of Venezuela's economic crisis. And as John Bolton has openly stated, he's one of the neocon war hawks that pushed this maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela. He has openly stated that one of the main goals is to hurt the Venezuelan economy to a degree in which the people of Venezuela will eventually turn against their government. And so these people who are certainly showing a case of Stockholm syndrome, begging the US for intervention, the very country that's strangholding their country and ready to, bomb it at any moment and take over the industries, that's what we're seeing. That's what's happening inside of Venezuela. And, but having said that, there are also AI generated content right now that's floating around, racking up millions of views on social media. And one of those videos was shared by Nick Shirley. He has millions of followers. He's one of the MAGA so-called journalists that came here to Minnesota, to Minneapolis, to expose the so-called Somali daycare fraud scheme, which, even local news here debunked that. We're not saying that fraud does not exist or corruption does not exist, but local news did debunk that. So we're going to show this video right now of AI generated videos that are going around showing celebrations inside Venezuela that are completely fake and false. So let's share this. I don't have my assistant with me today, so I'm sharing everything by myself. There's that. And let's play this video. Now, what's really interesting about this video is like when he's waving the flag, like it changed shape, like the yellow and the red like flip over. It's clearly AI. But what's really interesting is that this time, when you ask Grok if this is AI, Grok will tell you that it's real. So clearly there is an agenda to push these fake videos that are racking up millions of views on social media right now. And they're being promoted and pushed by pro-Trump supporters. So in this case, Grok is being programmed to absolutely say that this is not AI. And I have another video that I want to share. So 1 second. And I'm so sorry for being slow, just that I don't have my assistant with me today. So let's see here. And Alan, if you want to add anything about that other video, I'm going to share another one.
Sure. Which one is this? The anti-Maduro protester in, I think it's DC, is that right?
No, it's another AI video of like an old woman.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, this one, as you get it up, just bear in mind that this one was retweeted out by Elon Musk himself, and it reached, I don't know, 16 million people before I saw it.
I think this one Grok admits and says that it is AI because it's like so clearly AI. Whereas the last one, it was like a really good AI video, but this one is like very clear.
No, I'm afraid, Mnar, Grok was asked specifically if it's AI below by someone I was following, I think, and it said, yeah, this is absolutely real, despite the fact that if you play it, you can see absolutely clearly there's something about the faces which is obvious, and also the colors of the Venezuelan flag keep changing. Little bits of the video just keep removing themselves. Yeah, I mean it's really clearly
my
AI
mistake.
swap.
Yeah, my mistake. No, Grok definitely said that this is. Grok did not say that this is AI. My bad, everybody. My apologies.
Está libre. El pueblo llora por su libertad. Gracias a los Estados Unidos por liberarnos. Y viva la libertad. Oye, el dictador cayó. Finalmente. Estamos libres, estamos libres. Viva Venezuela libre. Gracias, Dios. Gracias. Oye, el dictador cayó finalmente. Granadito, hermano, esto es real. Estamos libres. Mira, mira cómo está la gente. ¡Viva Venezuela libre! Gracias a Dios, esto es para todos los que aguantaron, se logró. Estamos libres finalmente. Gracias, Donald Trump. ¡Viva la libertad! ¡Viva!
My God, I thought this was about drug trafficking, but it's like all we're being bombarded with is like about liberation and freedom and thank you, Trump. I mean, clearly from that video, everybody that was speaking had like the AI glitch with their mouth. And so and then Alan, you mentioned this was shared by Elon Musk himself.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was just thinking, watching that. I mean, in 2003, before Iraq, everyone was saying that, they'll greet us as liberators, and that was the big propaganda lie. But now technology has moved on, and they can actually just create videos that show us being greeted as liberators. I mean, it was false in 2003, and it's false now, but the technology has moved on, so we're like one level above in the slop bucket in hell world, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with the rise of AI, is that the future is going to hold a lot of fake stories like this, where people are celebrating. And, people who may not be educated about this issue, who are maybe confused, just like an average American, they're going to watch these videos and think that this is really a case of liberation and freedom. And I even saw some comments on there. And of course, they could be bots, but some of those comments were like, oh my gosh, I felt so emotional, and I felt the pain that these Venezuelan people are feeling. And they're like, this teared me up. Like, give me a break. Give me a break. All right. So those are the main, there's a lot more, by the way. Those are just two of the main AI videos that we picked to show, because they were among the most popular on X, and they were shared by Elon Musk to further promote this regime change operation. So let's talk about the opposition and who the United States wants to lead and take over the Venezuelan government. We've all heard about Maria Corina Machado. She's the Nobel Peace Prize winner. But some people that she's working with are people like David Smolensky, who's being promoted on CNN. CNN interviewed a Venezuelan named David Smolensky, and we're going to share this video. And then, Alan, you can tell us more about, or maybe you should tell us now while I'm getting it ready, about who he is and his role briefly within the Maria Corina Machado administration.
Yeah, well, I guess Smolensky has been working as an advisor to Machado for a long time. He's also a fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which I think a lot of people are aware of as a pretty shady organization where they get their money and what they've been doing, trying to whitewash history, whitewash the history of fascism in Europe, for example. And yes, Smolensky is a big part of that. And so many of these seriously sus people seem to have gone from Europe to Latin America, suspiciously in the mid-20th century, let's say.
All right, let's take a look at this. And if you notice, the first main comment on here is from me, my Instagram page. I actually have in here a comment saying, David Smolensky sounds very authentically Venezuelan. And in this reply here, you guys can check it out on this video. I have a bunch of Venezuelan expatriates like basically yelling at me on Instagram. So make sure to check that out. And yeah, these are definitely good examples of sus figures with, you know, who are clearly white and have very European names. And we'll learn more about him after we watch this video.
Plenty of other allies in Latin America and Europe and beyond. Thank you to President Trump and the whole administration of the United States, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, for this quick, smooth, and clean operation. With due respect to President Trump, Maria Corina Machado is the most trusted leader in Venezuela, and she's got the support from almost every Venezuelan. Obviously, the U.S. is going to be our main allies, and we will have plenty of other allies in Latin America and Europe. And
all right, so that's David Smolansky. David Smolansky. I don't know. That sounds like a pretty white name. And if you notice with all of these Venezuelan opposition leaders is, you know, they are white. They don't look like the native Venezuelans. And when I was in Venezuela, you know, when I traveled and spoke to the Venezuelans, most Venezuelans looked native to Venezuela, the ones that I went to and visited and spoke with directly. And the majority, I would say like 99.9% of everybody that I spoke to was very much supportive of the Bolivarian revolution. They were supportive of Chavez. They were supportive of President Maduro. And they were very much opposed to this very like elitist white opposition groups. And before we even get into the, well, actually, Alan, why don't you tell us more about him and Maria Corina Machado's, you know, political group that they've established? Because I wanted to show a video also of kind of like the racism that exists within the Venezuelan opposition. Because when we say like they're white, elitist, and they want to ally themselves with the US, they want to ally themselves with Israel, they really have this, you know, like white supremacist ideology. And it's not an exaggeration that they do, because if we look at some of the footage that came out from the opposition protests from a few years ago, they were attacking a lot of the Black and Native Venezuelans and calling them many dirty names. And I have a video of that. Should I play that quick before we get into who these people are?
Yeah, sure. Let's see it. Yeah, I'd like to see it.
Let's play this video. And it's a video of a pro Maria Corina Machado activist in Washington, D.C., I believe, or in Miami. I can't remember where this was. And they're yelling the N-word to a Black counter-protester who is opposing Donald Trump's, for opposing Donald Trump's invasion and abduction of President Maduro. 1 second, let me add this to the screen. I'm just a little bit slow, everyone. Thank you for your patience.
That's what we're doing. That's what needs to be done. That's USAID. That's what people got. Nigga, Africana. Country, you are not from the country. Don't be stupid. You are not from my country.
I love the Marine. God bless her. God bless America. You support his imprisonment.
La mejor operación quirúrgica en el picado del pueblo venezolano. No importa, no me importa eso. ¿Cuántos miles de venezolanos? ¿Cuántos miles de venezolanos?
All right, so that's a really good example of the kind of rhetoric that these people who support the opposition and who support Donald Trump to like kidnap President Maduro and to overthrow the democratically elected government of President Maduro. That's what we mean by like they have this white supremacist ideology when he's just openly calling this counter protester the N-word unprovoked. They're not even like talking to him, and he's just yelling this out. And this really gives us a taste of just how they are inside of Venezuela. And we have coverage that came from like Abby Martin, for example, when she's an independent journalist. I'm sure many of you know who she is. When she was in Venezuela covering the opposition protests, and they attacked her, and they were using a lot of really dirty words and violence against Black Venezuelans. Alan, can you elaborate on this racial aspect and this white supremacy that exists within this opposition?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ever since Christopher Columbus set foot on the Paria Peninsula in Venezuela in 1498, the country was set up as a white supremacist slave society where small numbers of Europeans enslaved huge numbers of Native Americans, or brought in huge numbers of African Black people in to be their slaves to produce primary products like coffee or cotton or sugar. Despite the fact that Venezuela gained its independence and slavery was formally abolished in the 19th century, that still means that the majority of Venezuela's history has been a racist slave society. And even though slavery was abolished, the economic system didn't actually change. There was no drastic, widespread land reform that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries, meaning that the people who owned the land, the descendants of the conquistadors, still control the land today. And those people are proudly European and guard their skin tone very, it's a very important thing for them. Moreover, when oil was discovered in the 20th century in Venezuela, Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous Amerindian Venezuelans were effectively blocked out of getting any of the jobs in that very lucrative industry. Until the 1960s, the official policy of the Venezuelan government was to whiten the race and improve the race by introducing large numbers of Europeans, mostly from Portugal, Spain, and Italy, attracting them from those countries to come to Venezuela. And the way they did that was by offering them large amounts of land, basically for free. That meant that there was a reasonably large class of Euro-Venezuelans, white Venezuelans, who were much richer than the rest, leading the great Uruguayan poet Eduardo Galeano to say about Venezuela that the poor are mostly Black and the Black are mostly poor. Now, there certainly are people who are Euro-Venezuelans are certainly part of the Venezuelan multiracial society. They are indigenous in a way to Venezuela, just like everyone else is. And, you know, they do have opinions, and certainly there is a pretty large percentage of them there. And I've certainly spoken to a lot of people in Venezuela who very much oppose the government, but there is this amalgamation of class and race politics inside the country. I'll give you a little anecdote. I was once at a pretty bougie breakfast spot, nothing crazy or anything, but it was in the east side of Caracas where the opposition is strongest. And there was about 50 to 100 people in there. And at one point I realized that I was actually the least white person in the entire cafe. And, you know, not to go into my own racial background, but, you know, I'm pretty white. And so for that to happen in Venezuela, where something about 2/3 of the country are of an African background or, you know, a non-white background, that's pretty surprising. And the same day I went to a huge left-wing youth rally movement, which there was about 1,200 people in one big tent there. And I also realized there that actually I was probably the second least white person there. I could only see one person in this giant room that I was in for hours who wasn't actually of a darker skin tone to me. And that really gets to the heart of the Venezuelan political experience. What we've seen since 1998 and the election of Hugo Chavez is a multiracial coalition of working class people coming together, forming a numerical majority against this white elite in order to try to create a more democratic, as I said, a more democratic multiracial society, which actually works in favor of working people and not the elite who have been in charge of the country for 500 years. So many of the leaders of the opposition can trace their lineage all the way back to people like, Simon Bolivar or Hernan Cortez or Francisco Pizarro or the Spanish monarchs or something. And they treat this as a badge of honor. But in Venezuela, that really means that, they're rather something of an oddity. And yeah, what this means is ultimately Venezuela is a multiracial society which has never had a civil rights movement. And yet there is this idea that they're all one race. They have this idea of a coffee with milk society. Everyone's a little bit coffee and a little bit milk, meaning a little bit dark-skinned, a little bit white-skinned. And, maybe some people are more like an espresso and some people are more like a latte, but, we're all the same. And that means that openly racial language in Venezuela is completely tolerated in a way that simply isn't in the United States, to the point where you can have right-wing, white Venezuelans screaming the N-word at people and thinking that is completely normal. I'll give you another anecdote that you hinted at in your question. In 2017, there were a bunch of far-right street barricades that killed dozens of people, the guarimbas they were called, where by right-wing opposition groups barricaded key places in Caracas and other cities. They put razor wire across the roads to garrote motorcyclists going past, etc. And they went out searching for Black Venezuelans because in their minds, it was assumed that if you were Black, you were both working class and a pro-government supporter, because in their mind, they basically couldn't conceive of like an Afro-Venezuelan being on their side. And so there are multiple cases of them finding Afro-Venezuelans and lynching them in public, on camera, dousing them in gasoline, lighting them up and turning them into a human torch. And you can find these videos if you want on YouTube and other places. So yeah, there is an important racial aspect to this. And, you said that these people are sort of, going against their interests. But I actually think if we look at it through a class dynamic, the sort of people that we've been talking about in the opposition, they want the sort of country, the sort of economic system that Venezuela was ruled under until the 1990s to come back, which is that Venezuela would provide oil to the global north, specifically the United States, and that the majority of people would remain poor, and the top 10% of the elite would get very well-paid jobs in the oil sector, and the rest of them would, just fight for scraps. That's the sort of country that they desire. And so that's the sort of country that, Mr. Smolensky or, Tor Halverson, who's another Venezuelan human rights activist whose, father was involved in some pretty shady, allegedly some pretty shady drug running stuff with the CIA in the 1980s, according to certain reports anyway, want to see. And, it's so obvious when you go there that there is this racial aspect to politics there, but it's never commented in the mainstream press. And so ultimately people are completely unaware of this. But we do get, these ridiculous figures popping up like Smolensky or Halverson, which leads to the memes that we've seen, like "Help, My Country, Venezuela Yearns for Freedom" by Sabine Mengele Eichmann. I'm sure people have seen that, but that does have a basis in reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, and if this had anything to do with actually supporting the human rights of the Venezuelan people, of course, the United States wouldn't be pushing a maximum pressure sanctions regime against Venezuela. And the first person that the United States would probably prosecute, kidnap, capture, and put on trial is Netanyahu for committing a genocide inside of Gaza. But then again, the United States oversaw that genocide, funded it, and armed that genocide for the last 2 years, and have uplifted that apartheid system through financing and political cover for decades. So, for those who read MintPress, we all know that this is a war of resources. And, part of the strategy, if you look at a lot of these regime change operations, whether it's in Ukraine or in Libya or in Syria, the United States always backs the most extremist aspects of these societies that are going to continue to destabilize these countries. And right now in our comment section on YouTube during this live stream, we have supporters of the Trump supporters from the Venezuelan opposition that have joined our comment section. And
welcome. Welcome.
I'm gonna, welcome. So we're gonna show the first comment here, which is the fact that a Muslim woman is judging us Venezuelans here is outrageous, given that her religion kills or forcibly converts by far the most people through terror. So the fact that we have this kind of comment really is symbolic, because first of all, I'm not just some Muslim woman. I'm an American Palestinian woman who lived under Israeli occupation and witnessed firsthand the brutality of the US military machine, and know firsthand how the US government, our military, and the pro-Israel Zionist establishment are pushing for this kind of fake rules-based order and regime change operations to fulfill this capitalist system. And so, and our job, of course, myself and Alan MacLeod, we're independent journalists, and our job is to scrutinize our own government, not promote regime change for an empire ruled by literal pedophiles and psychopathic war criminals, because that's who we are ruled by. So just so people know, they have entered the chat. They're here, and we'll let our readers and viewers kind of take it from there. So I want to talk a little bit more about Israel's role. We can't talk about Venezuela or these regime change operations without talking about this Zionist push for these war policies. I mean, yes, the United States is committing this, kidnapping of Maduro, but we had in the past few weeks Israeli politicians flying around Latin America pushing for this policy, including in Paraguay. Israeli politicians, I forgot which specific politician it was. It's not coming to my, it's at the tip of my tongue right now. But Israeli politicians were in Paraguay and other Latin American countries talking about how Maduro has to go and his days are basically numbered. And this is not new. I mean, the fact that Israel has aligned, or not Israel, Venezuela has aligned itself with other countries that are sanctioned, like Iran, to lean on them because of the US sanctions regime that has completely destroyed its economy. Israel has for decades openly stated that they want regime change inside of Venezuela for its solidarity with Palestine and for aligning itself with Iran. And of course, every time Iran has tried to support Venezuela through shipping food or gas or fuel or supplies to help rebuild Venezuela, we saw the United States being supported by Israel, by Netanyahu himself, to steal Venezuelan, or to steal aid that was on its way to Venezuela. And so, Alan, much of this opposition, including Maria Corina Machado, are very, very supportive of Israel. They push, just like this comment in our YouTube comment section, they push out a lot of Islamophobia. They show that they are very much have a white supremacist ideology, and they're happy to align themselves with apartheid, with a genocidal regime in Israel. I mean, Maria Corina Machado has already stated that she wants to open up an embassy, an Israeli embassy inside of Venezuela, which, for those who know about Venezuela, they cut all ties under the Hugo Chavez government with Israel for its crimes against Palestine and for its occupation and colonialism. And Hugo Chavez made Palestine a national cause. And President Maduro carried on that mission to keep Palestine a national cause. They said, both of them, all of Venezuela is Palestine, and all of Palestine is Venezuela, meaning we are brothers and sisters in the same struggle. But we have this Venezuelan opposition wanting to break that and realign itself with the apartheid state of Israel. And even Maria Corina Machado has also said that she would support the opening of the Israeli embassy inside of Jerusalem after moving it from Tel Aviv. So what can you tell us about the opposition's support for Israel?
A lot of people don't realize just how closely connected the Venezuelan opposition and Maria Corina Machado specifically are to Israel, and specifically to the Likud party. Vente Venezuela, which is Maria Corina Machado's party, is in a formal alliance with Likud, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party. And a couple of years ago, Machado actually wrote a letter, a formal letter, which was published. She wrote it to Netanyahu asking for Israeli military intervention in Venezuela. On the flip side, as you mentioned, Venezuela under the socialists has become a leader in the worldwide struggle for national liberation for Palestine. I was speaking to the Palestinian ambassador. It wasn't the last time I was in Venezuela. I think it was 2-3 times ago, but it was about a year ago anyway. And yeah, he told me that he considers Venezuela to be the leader internationally of Palestine solidarity. Wherever you go in Caracas or any of the other major cities in Venezuela, you will constantly see murals, political artwork on the walls depicting Palestinian fighters, Palestinian poets, Palestinian artists, Palestinian civilians. There are memorials to Palestine. The flag is absolutely everywhere because people in the global south understand that their struggle is intimately linked with Palestine. And conversely, the rulers or the reactionary elites of countries in the global south understand that they are fundamentally connected to Israel. That's why, of course, when Maduro put his ballot into the ballot box in July 2024, he shouted, "Long live free Palestine," in front of all the press, while Maria Corina Machado openly said that Israel's struggle is our struggle. And so ultimately, these sorts of currents in politics and struggle are closely connected, even if we don't realize it ourselves. When you start to scrutinize these things, actually, there's a lot of intercontinental connections here.
Sorry, we have a little bit of a visitor. I left my door open, so our cat has entered the live stream. So there's no question that, Israel is very much supportive of Maduro being kidnapped by the Trump administration. And I would argue that the timing of all of this really coincides with a lot of things that have come out from the Epstein files against Trump. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I just have a feeling that there's a lot that the Netanyahu and Israeli government have on Trump, and they are pushing Trump to fulfill a lot of the Israeli ambitions for war. This is just my personal perspective, take it or leave it, because if you notice, the Netanyahu government keeps having closed-door meetings with Trump. I mean, every couple of months, they're having closed-door meetings, talking in private, and the next thing you know, Trump is threatening a new war. We saw Trump, bomb Iran, for example. The U.S. hasn't really done that before. They bombed Iran, and then now the Trump administration is again threatening to interfere and intervene inside of Iran with the rise of these new protests. But then we also have people like Mike Pompeo tweeting that he wishes the protesters in Iran a new year, and also the Mossad agents who are walking beside them a happy new year as well. And so Israeli newspapers like Israel Hayom and Haaretz have quoted Israeli intelligence officials and Israeli politicians regularly stating that the Israeli government wants regime change inside of Venezuela, and they want regime change in Iran. And they are always talking about both of these countries together. They always coincide together in the same articles. And if you notice right now, within the same time frame, we have this eruption of protests inside of Iran. Much of them are legitimate. I mean, every country has dissent, okay? Every country has legitimate frustrations with their government, with their policies. But when Mike Pompeo is telling us, he's former head of CIA, telling us that he's thinking Mossad agents and Israel's intelligence be walking side by side, we know that probably these protests are being influenced by Israel. I mean, that's just the truth. They're openly saying it. And that's what's really lovely about the Republican Party, is that sometimes they just say the quiet part out loud. Like, whatever we thought was happening, usually they confirm it for us. And they're confirming it for us right now. And right before Trump kidnapped President Maduro, he had a closed-door meeting with Netanyahu. And just literally a week prior to that, Israel's newspapers were calling for regime change. And within days of that, Israeli politicians were parading across Latin America to push that idea as well. And Alan, excuse me, before we get into the Monroe Doctrine, I really want to hear more about the response from Mexico and Colombia, because those two administrations, and maybe even Nicaragua, because Nicaragua is also a target of US imperialism, but how are Venezuela's allies in the region responding? Because we have this rise of more leftist governments inside of Mexico and inside of Colombia with Gustavo Petro. And Trump is now threatening to invade Colombia as well. I don't know if that will actually happen, but hey, you just never know these days.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about what's going on here is how clearly that you can see the difference between the haves and have-nots, between the global north and the global south, between the colonizing countries and the colonized, because their responses, their government's responses to this abduction have been night and day. So while you get people like Emmanuel Macron of France saying that the Venezuelan people today are rid of Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship and can only rejoice, or Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, saying that, you know, the brutally oppressive criminal regime of Nicolas Maduro is over, and expressing his barely concealed, in fact, not even concealed joy about what's happening. Leaders from the global south have taken a completely different tact. As we said, you know, countries across Latin America have come together to release statements categorically rejecting what has happened. As you said, Colombia has done so. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the former president of Mexico, said that, you know, he's formally retired from politics, but he said he would, you know, unretire to make a political statement about what's happened here, because it's such a awful, gangsterish, grave breach of the international order that he felt compelled to speak. Countries as diverse as Ghana and South Africa and Malaysia are releasing strong statements of support for the Venezuelan people, for the Venezuelan government, and calling this absolutely criminal and a grave breach of international law, something which our media and Western politicians are shying away from, because tacitly they absolutely know that this is one of the most outrageous and outlandish breaches of international law that we've seen for many decades, actually, since 36 years to the day since the United States kidnapped the president of Panama, Manuel Noriega, for actually similar charges. Even the government of Switzerland has gone so far as to freeze the assets of the Venezuelan government inside Swiss banks. And that could trigger a huge consequence for that nation and for global capital in general, because that is going to signal to everyone that actually Swiss banks are not quite as safe for your billions as perhaps you might think. Because if at any point the Swiss government decides that, you know, it gets the telephone call from the United States, it could easily freeze your assets. That's a country that has built its wealth in no small part in hiding stolen assets from around the world, from the Nazi government in Germany, for example, to all sorts of dictators in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So for them to come out and do that, we're living in a brave new 21st century Cold War world where the United States is increasingly putting pressure on its allies to toe the line in this Cold War against Russia and China. And maybe Venezuela, this kidnapping, is one of the first shots and one of the first salvo of shots in this new Cold War that will begin getting hotter and hotter as the 21st century goes on. I don't know. What do you think, Mnar?
Well, I want to talk more about this kind of Cold War stuff that's happening between Cold War rhetoric that's happening between the United States, China, and Russia, because I think people don't realize. Well, we know that this is a war for resources. I mean, that's been established, and also so that the United States can have more control over Latin America and push for U.S. hegemony over Latin America, because it seems like there's this, wave of revolutionary ideology kind of making its way through Latin America again, and the U.S. is losing its grip over power inside of Latin America. And this whole kidnapping of Maduro, obviously, like, it's clearly international law does not exist. We learned that, of course, from every previous war. We were reminded about that when Israel launched its genocide against Gaza. And we're reminded again that international law does not exist. No, the US does not follow international law. Israel does not follow international law, and they act with impunity. There are no consequences to their actions. And Trump just showed that he will fulfill Israeli war ambitions no matter what. But I want to talk about how not only is this a war for resources, but this is also a part of a Cold War against Russia and China, and for minerals, because the United States needs these minerals that Venezuela has. Venezuela has the largest mineral deposits in the world, not just in Latin America, but in the world. And they are unable to actually extract their own minerals at a faster and higher rate and pace because their machinery is still old, and because of sanctions, they haven't been able to upgrade their machinery. I think people forget about that. I actually visited, I know I'm going on talking about a lot of things here, but I actually visited, one of the iron ore mines inside of Venezuela, and I toured it, and I felt like I had walked, like I had entered a time machine to 1965. Everything there was so old, and they were talking about how they just need basic tools and supplies to upgrade these machinery, and they were unable to because of US sanctions. But Maria Corina Machado is telling US corporations openly, and she's telling Trump, hey guys, you guys can have full access to this. And Trump is happy to jump in. He's even said, we want to take over the mineral reserves and upgrade the mines, meaning they know very well that Venezuela hasn't been able to upgrade the mines to extract these minerals, to enjoy that wealth, to use that wealth for their own country. There's a reason why Venezuela is still poor, and it's because of those sanctions. And so I want to talk about the mineral wealth, because the oil one is so obvious, but what about the mineral wealth? And why is Trump now threatening also Greenland? So we've got Venezuela's mineral wealth, Greenland's mineral wealth as well, and how this is part of a broader mineral war with China, where China has partnerships and trade relations with many African countries to get access to minerals.
Yeah, I mean, I guess starting with the obvious, Venezuela has the largest crude oil reserves in the world, extra thick, heavy crude oil, which, as you said, they're not able to produce at such a high rate because specifically they have been under sanction for more than a decade. Their machinery, their entire apparatus is an American setup, meaning that once America cuts you off from spare parts and all the stuff that you actually need to maintain that industry, it quickly sputters and shutters to a halt. But Venezuela also has all sorts of important minerals, as you were talking about, including gold. It is mineral-wise a very rich country indeed. And that's one of the many reasons why the United States is interested in controlling it. It's not a small country with no resources, and it's not, unstrategic or anything. It's a very important country in that aspect. And that's one reason why the US and all its talking heads have been absolutely obsessed with the country for a quarter of a century since Hugo Chavez came to power, because under previous administrations, the United States, and specifically corporations in the United States, were making absolute bank from the country. Half the profits from the Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was the largest company that ever existed until 1970, came from Venezuela. So it was enormously important to US capital. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is a redrawing of the borders of the spheres of influence in geopolitics. We've seen Russia and China rising and trying to assert themselves, and the United States doing the same. Trump has redeclared the existence of the Monroe Doctrine, calling it, the Donroe Doctrine. If people don't know, the Monroe Doctrine was announced in 1823 by President Monroe, and they said basically that all other empires were completely forbidden from entering the Americas, and the Western Hemisphere belonged to the United States alone. And the US has acted upon that for 200 years. That's been their mentality the whole time. And that's why people like Donald Trump say things like our oil when he's talking about oil that's under the ground of Venezuela and in the Caribbean. That should be bizarre and completely unintelligible to people. But if you understand that the United States has always thought in this mentality of the Monroe Doctrine, it makes it much more clear. Now, as the world warms up, and as the fight over the world starts to move towards the northern hemisphere between the United States, Russia, and China, the Arctic has become much more strategic as shipping lanes have opened. And that means that Trump is now much more interested in directly controlling Greenland. Of course, the United States has always had significant access to and control over Greenland. It's formally owned by its NATO partner, Denmark. But as we all know, the United States is the driving force behind NATO. But now Trump wants to make that formal. He wants to say the quiet part out loud again and wants to formally annex Greenland, turning it into maybe the 51st state, just like he suggested they would do with Canada as well. So what we're seeing is, again, this global 21st century fight that the United States is involved in, trying to suppress China and to a lesser extent Russia, but certainly trying to suppress China's rise to become the most important country in the world, as it has been for most of the last 2 millennia. That is the story that's going to be panning out. And right now, the United States is desperate, trying to shore up its own colonies as it sees it and expand as much as it can to try to get as many minerals as possible. Because in some areas, particularly some of the rare earth minerals, China has a decisive advantage. And that's something that the United States would want to change.
Well, I think people need to remember that pretty much every single war that we've seen in our lifetime, Alan, has been some sort of Cold War competing with China for minerals. I mean, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq or places like in Yemen or even in Sudan or in Somalia or in Ethiopia, all of these places represent a US Cold War and competition with China's rise. Not only in those regions, but also just a strategic, placement of US troops and embassies and bases and extraction for those minerals in those countries to destabilize them so that the United States can extract those minerals for themselves to fuel their own military, AI and tech sector. Let's talk more about the Monroe Doctrine and US power. I mean, commentators are saying that this is a return to a previous era in US politics where the US asserts itself on the hemisphere as it pleases. And right now we're hearing this even newer term called the Donroe Doctrine. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, but let's talk about what is the Monroe Doctrine, how it's playing out right now, and what is this new Donroe Doctrine that Trump is pushing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just reiterate that this has been US policy for more than 200 years now. The United States sees itself and has seen itself from its very inception as an empire. And the US wants to control as much of the world as possible. And in 1823, President Monroe declared that all of the Western Hemisphere, meaning all of the Americas, belonged to the United States, and that other powers, particularly the United Kingdom and Spain, were not welcome to colonize the place. It was theirs for the taking. And in the last 200 years, we've seen the United States treat Latin America as its own backyard. We've seen the US Marines go into Haiti in 1915 and stay there for nearly 20 years, for example. The US invade Nicaragua because the country slighted one of its oligarchs, Cornelius Vanderbilt. We've seen coup after coup after coup across Latin America in the 20th century, ranging from the famous ones like Chile in 1973 or Brazil in 1964 to ones that are not as well known, like the ones I have mentioned before, like the Panamanian coup in 1989, or the ones against the New Jewel movement in Grenada, or the government of Chede Jagan in Guyana. Virtually every country in Latin America and the Caribbean has felt the presence of Uncle Sam's jackboot on its neck at some point or another. It's always there, but sometimes the United States presses down even more. In the last few years, we've heard more and more American talking heads, people working at think tanks, etc., talking about how the Monroe Doctrine has to come back into full force. And that's what we've seen as Latin America has elected waves of left-wing governments. The United States has reacted. The empire has struck back using political pressure, sanctions, coups to overthrow these governments, like we saw against the progressive government in Brazil of Dilma Rousseff, or in Paraguay against Fernando Lugo, and there are so many examples of this. So with the return of Trump, however, as we said, he says the quiet part out loud and really uses the big stick in a way in which other presidents have staved their hand slightly. Trump is going around threatening any country that doesn't completely kowtow to the United States, not only economically, but very visibly politically, with invasion, with annexation. Even countries that other presidents would probably have the good grace not to formally threaten, like, for example, Canada or Greenland. We're seeing that happen right now. Trump talked about how it would be cool if the United States invaded Venezuela because it's really part of the United States. As you said earlier, he said he intends to run Venezuela. Other people have said Cuba is next. So clearly the United States has imperial ambitions in the region. And that's really, I've always said, you can't understand the United States if you don't start with the basic premise that it is an empire. It sees itself as the rightful owner of the entire world. That's why there are well over 800 military bases around the world. That's why the United States has carried out more than 250 foreign military operations since 1991 alone. That's why there are 400 military bases encircling China right now, because the United States understands that without McDonnell and Douglas, McDonald's couldn't exist, meaning that it is the power of the US military that enforces the US-led economic system, which enriches the corporate elite who have made trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars out of the suffering of the global South. And that is what people are fighting against. That is what President Maduro and the socialist movement in Venezuela have always been fighting against. And that, frankly, is why they've been targeted.
And for those who are still with us here in this live stream, we want to thank you for watching this and helping us get over 100,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel. We're going to talk more with Alan. We're not going away just yet, but we just wanted to say thank you to everybody and remind our viewers that we were recently targeted by pro-Zionist actors who shut our fundraiser down on Indiegogo. We put out a public fundraiser, raised over $50,000, and had our payout withheld by Indiegogo. And so we are trying to recover those funds. We are an independent news outlet, and we rely very heavily on our donors and our members. And so if you'd like to help us continue this very important reporting, then we ask that you help us recover our funds by going directly on our website to mintpressnews.com/donations, and it's inside the YouTube comments. And also, if you want to become a member, that also helps us even more to help sustain our independent investigative journalism. Everything that we have talked about during this live stream, all the information is because we have been around MintPress for 14 years. And so a lot of the information we've been talking about is not necessarily new information, but things that we've been tracking with the US imperial agenda to take over Venezuela and its resources in this Cold War. And this reporting has been made possible by journalists like Alan MacLeod, his investigations, and they're on our website at mintpressnews.com. Our website acts like an encyclopedia of US, covering US empire. And so we want to continue our reporting. And so we ask that you become a member or help us recover those funds. So we thank you also for helping us get over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Although we have been around for 14 years, we've only been heavily pushing video podcasts and live stream just in the last 1.5 to 2 years. So we thank you for supporting us in that way. And so I want also to let everybody know before we get to the final question to Alan that later this week, I will be interviewing local Venezuelans on the ground to talk about what's happening. So stay with us during the week to follow those interviews. And Alan, we obviously need to touch on the fact that we have USAID and the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, that has been funding the opposition. They've been funding actual propaganda to push Venezuelans to oppose their government. These are the same institutions, pro-democracy institutions that work as the arm of U.S. empire. They were currently funding propaganda campaigns, regime change campaigns, color revolution campaigns against Iran, against Syria. They were used inside of Ukraine. And they have a very strong history of influencing Venezuela's opposition. And so, apart from Maria Corina Machado being an arm of U.S. empire, how has USAID and the NED helped prop up this opposition and, pushed ideas that, Maria Corina Machado is the so-called Nelson Mandela of Latin America? Can you tell us more about all of those things and Maria Corina Machado herself?
Yeah, so I think perhaps the best way of starting to answer that question is going back to April 11th, 2002, which was the date of a coup against Hugo Chavez, President Maduro's successor. On that day, the coup plotters arrived at the head of a media baron's house, Gustavo Cisneros. There at the time was Charles Shapiro, the American ambassador, was there. The United States immediately endorsed the coup, and we know from documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, we knew that the United States knew exactly who was going to plan out the coup, where they were going to do it, and how they were going to do it as well. And that the United States had been funding, training, and otherwise supporting these activists for months, if not years, before them, flying them back and forth to Washington. In fact, US support for this coup, this upcoming coup, was so obvious that actually there were senators in the United States who, weeks before the coup even took place, were asking questions on the floor, trying to get safeguards against, trying to get the United States to confirm that it was not going to participate in this upcoming coup. Chavez was taken prisoner and abducted. He was flown to a military base. He said in his personal testimony that there was American military personnel there, or at least American personnel there, I should say, a US warship sailed into Venezuelan waters on the day of the coup. We can put two and two together here. One of the leaders of this coup was Maria Corina Machado, who afterwards, she signed, well, on the day of the coup, she signed a document which liquidated every single democratic institution in Venezuela, including the courts, every elected representative, and she signed over the right to the country to be run by a pro-US business magnate called Pedro Carmona. After this happened, she decided to rebrand herself as a pro-democracy activist. Her organization, Sumate, which is like a political pressure group, an election monitoring group, has been funded for more than 2 decades by the National Endowment for Democracy, which, as MintPress viewers I'm sure know, but perhaps not everybody watching this knows, is a front group for the CIA. The NED was set up by the Reagan administration after a number of scandals hit the CIA. And it was set up as a quasi-privatized company, completely funded by the US government, that would take care of a lot of the dirtiest and most controversial things that the CIA was doing all around the world, including overthrowing foreign governments. As the former head of the CIA, of the NED said, a lot of what we do today was done covertly by the CIA 20 years ago. So everybody knows what it means to take money from the National Endowment for Democracy. And all in total, the United States has spent 9 figures, so hundreds of millions of dollars, on regime change operations in Venezuela, promoting all sorts of groups, be they political, social, religious, all sorts of community groups, all with one thing in common: an overt hostility to the government of Venezuela. And so really, there has been virtually no section of the opposition that hasn't been touched by US money over these past 25 years. And Machado is a perfect example of this. I mean, she was getting flown back and forth to Washington, D.C. for meetings with senior Bush administration officials, including President Bush himself in 2005, who met her in the Oval Office, which is something that is usually reserved for foreign heads of state. They did that for this relatively lesser-known politician in Machado. And so ultimately, the Venezuelan opposition has been bankrolled and driven by the US State Department and various 3-letter agencies for many decades. That, of course, doesn't mean that everyone in Venezuela who opposes Maduro is a pawn of the United States. I'm not saying that there aren't large numbers of people in Venezuela who oppose the government. It's very clear that there are. If you go to Venezuela and they realize that you're not a local, maybe you're not speaking Spanish fluently enough, they will talk your ear off about how they oppose the government. So they definitely exist. But the entire political milieu inside Venezuela has been shaped by this enormous interference by the United States. The sort of thing of which, even if we could prove 1/10,000th of which Russia was doing in the US or in Western Europe, we would probably go to war over. But since it's Venezuela and since it's the United States, it's just seen as normal. And that's something that we have to break in the future.
Alan MacLeod, you have been such a great resource for myself and for all of the viewers who have tuned in to learn more about the US sabotaging plans to overthrow the government of Venezuela for decades. And so thank you so much for being here. And we want to thank everybody for watching and tuning into this live stream. We're going to wrap it up here, but we are going to have an interview tomorrow that I'm going to be doing with local independent journalists based in Caracas, talking about what they're seeing on the ground, so that we can hear from locals, local Venezuelans. And so I'm excited to do that